Ah, yes, and that is Susan Werner with Kickin' the Beehive. And it's time for our Fourth Friday Focus with the Oregon Center for Public Policy. And our guest today is Daniel Hauser, who holds a master's degree in public policy from Oregon State University. He's very studied in the area of higher education, and he's been a Hatfield resident fellow at Portland State University Center for Public Service. And he's been at Oregon Center for Public Policy for about 3 years or so. Welcome, Daniel, to Willamette Wake Up.
Good morning, Mark. Thanks for having me back. And I appreciate you pointing out that I've been with OCPP for 3 years, and I aspire to reach that level. I'm actually just on my 7th month here at OCPP, and I'll take any of the credit you want to give me.
I'm just reading off the website.
Well, we'll have to.
I see. I see what it says now. I misread that. It says after 3 years at the Association of Oregon Counties as a transportation policy analyst. I misread that, and but your experience is growing with every month.
Yeah, absolutely. This is my first time confronting the kicker, although we've certainly confronted it many times in the past, and it's a pretty astonishing policy that I look forward to chatting with you about.
Yes, indeed, and we did open this segment with "Kickin' the Beehive" by Susan Werner, and I thought we would kick this around for a little bit, and so. The kicker. We have the kicker, and why don't you explain to folks, just what the kicker is and how unique it might be in the country? I'm not exactly sure myself, but I'd never heard about it before I came to Oregon. That's for sure.
Yeah, it is one of the things that makes Oregon unique, amongst a variety of other little things that we like to culturally claim, including our aversion to things like umbrellas. But the kicker is a pretty unique policy. I believe we're the only state with this exact type of provision that's actually in our Constitution. And what it is a tax cut that's automatically triggered whenever the state economists mispredict the revenue that'll be coming into the state's general fund by 2% or more. And they make that prediction 2 years prior. So essentially, Oregon's economy is highly dependent, as many people know, on state and global economies. I mean, we're on just over 1% of the national economy. And yet the state economist's office has to predict exactly what our economy is going to do and what the revenues that come in based on that projection are 2 years out. And if they're off by only 2% or more, then all of that amount that they missed by goes back to taxpayers. So it's a pretty tall order for the state economist's office, and they actually do a pretty phenomenal job. It amazes me that this doesn't happen every biennium.
So now, did we have a kicker during the last biennium? It seems like we did. Do you even remember?
That's a good question. I think the kicker that I most remember is the one that happened just prior to our last recession. That was a pretty egregious one that totaled about $1 billion that was sent back, just as Oregon's economy was falling to a recession and our revenues then plummeted. And so that $1 billion was sent back to taxpayers at the same time as we were just getting ready to cut services to our low-income Oregonians, cut school funding, and really put ourselves as a state in a really precarious situation that ended up requiring revenue increases to stave off even worse cuts with the ballot measures 66 and 67. And so it's Oregon's kicker has happened quite a few times in the past couple decades, and it's something that has had very egregious consequences. And usually it happens when the economy is doing well, as the economy is doing now, particularly in Oregon. We've seen really stellar wage growth, or I shouldn't say stellar wage growth, but we've seen better than recent history wage growth that's been really positive, and our unemployment rates, bouncing around at record lows over the last year. And so really it's usually a consequence of Oregon's economy doing better than expected. And it's just interesting that one of our most egregious kickers happened just prior to the economy entering recession.
Well, now we have there was two kickers initially, and there was a corporate tax kicker and the individual tax kicker, and they've actually taken the corporate tax kicker and sort of what have they done with that? Now, that was a relatively recent policy change.
It was, yeah. The corporate income tax also has a kicker, just like the personal does. And instead of being sent back to corporations, it's now sent to the education fund. And so Oregon voters actually decided pretty recently that instead of sending that money back because the state economists mispredicted how much corporations would pay in taxes, which are actually quite a bit more volatile than personal income taxes. But instead of sending those back to the corporations, we now put that money towards our schools, which is really a much more wise and prudent use of those funds. I mean, one of the things that's important to keep in mind about the kicker is that these funds are a misestimate on what is going to be brought in. These aren't funds that are overpaid, right? These are all taxes that are due based on the tax rates and tax base we have in law. And so this money is money that the corporations owed, and we're now spending it on our schools rather than sending it back to the corporations. And in this upcoming biennium, it'll total about $110 million that'll be invested in education rather than being invested, back into corporations.
Well, now the kicker, one thing about especially the individual kicker is it's an incredibly popular policy. And whenever I mention the kicker to anyone, their eyes light up and they just like do a little dance. And I'm not sure people understand the implications of of what they're happy about.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true, and I think people often overestimate what they're getting back in the kicker too.
Sure.
I mean, the kicker is a pretty remarkable fiscal policy in that what we're doing is taking money that our state might need, and for no reason other than an error in a forecast from years ago, sending that money back out. This is a situation where in this last budget period, decisions were made for the upcoming budget period to not fund schools at a level that will prevent teacher layoffs. So we're at the same time as we're sending this upcoming kicker will be about $464 million. At the same time as we're sending those revenue or that revenue back to taxpayers, we're laying off the teachers that are teaching their kids, and so it's kind of a trade-off that people probably don't fully understand and appreciate. That the kicker resources could be used for really, really important and laudable outcomes instead of, for the average Oregonian, it'll be $89 that they'll get back in either reduced taxes next year or a slightly larger refund. That's not a lot of money, although it certainly helps, and I'm not turning mine down. But the result is that we're instead of funding important services, we're sending back less than $100 to each Oregon family on average.
And not only that, but it seems like people who, where most of the kicker money goes are people who pay more taxes, in other words, have much higher incomes.
That's absolutely true. The state economists estimated that about $4,900 on average will go to the wealthiest 1% or the highest earning 1% of Oregon taxpayers in the last tax cycle. It's quite the contrast compared to the $89 the median Oregonian will get, and it's pretty egregious. I mean, some of our calculations showed that the top 5% of taxpayers will actually get 40% of the kicker money.
Wow.
The bottom 80% will only get 30% of the kicker money. And so it's very much a situation where people get excited. I mean, they're getting money from the government. Not every day that happens, right? It is something that your eyes probably should light up for if you don't think too deeply about what the ramifications are and the fact that you're kind of getting pennies relative to what a lot of the wealthiest Oregonians are pulling out of our state's general fund.
Yeah, it's amazing how people feel about that. I almost felt like framing a letter I got from the IRS one time that said, you owe zero. Because we had some argument over what I owed. They finally admitted I owed nothing, and they sent me a letter. I said, how often do you get that from the IRS?
No, that's certainly true.
So anyways, so you got $464 million coming, a lot of it going to rich folks, and it's kind of a crazy policy. Now, is there any movement to change this policy, and was there anything happening in the last session on this?
There was some consideration, actually, by members of both parties on how to address the kicker in a way that doesn't cause entirely a taxpayer uproar. So by sending it to the Education Stability Fund, or what we would most prefer is that they send it to the Oregon Rainy Day Fund. As I mentioned earlier, when we had the dramatic kicker just prior to the Great Recession, if we'd instead tucked those funds away, not spent them on what whatever legislature wanted, which I mentioned earlier could have gone towards schools, which would have been positive, but instead of kind of getting into that political game, if we had just put it away into a savings account in case of the next emergency, we would have saved thousands of teacher jobs, and we would have really put ourselves in a situation where we were much better prepared for when the recession is going to happen. And it's really important, I think, to point out that we're now in the third longest economic expansion since World War II. So our economy has been growing and doing well for quite a while since our last recession, and generally speaking, we should be nearing. I mean, there's no rule that we're going to hit a recession exactly at 8 years after the last one, but we fully expect that in the next few biennia we will hit another recession. And instead of putting this money to particular services or purposes, if we were to just save it and use it to survive the next economic downturn, that would really be the most fiscally prudent and responsible way to do it. And to kind of get back, more specifically to your question, there is a lot of opposition to doing anything with the kicker. People are afraid of being the one legislator who's out there speaking explicitly about the need to send this kicker money back to some other service. And so we really think that the best way to move forward would be for legislators to take that bold choice, to be courageous, and to put this money in the rainy day fund. That way it would be a really fiscally responsible thing to do and would prevent at least some of the backlash of feeling that we're just spending this all on random pet projects.
And that would require a constitutional amendment, is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. To fully amend the kicker and to do something really unique with it in terms of putting all of it, both now and into the future, into a rainy day fund or into services, it would require a constitutional amendment because Oregon voters did put this into our Constitution not that long ago.
Wow.
Although one thing I do want to point out is that the legislature in the Constitution have the power to suspend the kicker, to declare an emergency, and to use those kicker funds for the purposes that they feel are highest priority. The reason it didn't happen in this last legislative session is because it requires a 2/3 majority. So many of your listeners will be familiar with the 3/5 majority, the supermajority that's required to pass a tax increase. Well, it's an even higher bar to suspend the kicker.
Well, that's interesting, and that kind of helps me transition to our second topic for the day, and that is in the face of this recovery and this incredibly low unemployment rate that we've haven't experienced for a great long time. We are having budget problems, partly because of our match on the Affordable Care Act and covering all those extra Medicaid folks, and that's one of the big ones. But we are having budget crisis in Oregon, and we've had this recovery now for 8 or 9 years, and one of the things that's really lagging from pre-recession levels is funding in higher education. And go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that that's absolutely true. We've seen, since before the recession, per student state funding for higher education in Oregon is down over 16% still. Wow.
And so is there, what's causing this? And is there, I've noticed that there seems to be, and sort of this conservative wave that's kind of hit the nation with Mr. Trump and all these other things. I've been noticing conservative commentators even making comments that college isn't even necessary anymore and things like this. And I'm just wondering if the lag in funding is part of more of a national movement to kind of restrict public funding for education.
I think that's a great point. There's some great research out by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities that points out that the vast majority of states have not even come close to filling the deficits in higher education funding that occurred during the recession when everyone's budgets were even tighter. One of the things I think is really important to highlight, too, is that higher education has an immense return on investment. So for the average Oregonian who's thinking about whether or not to attend college or whether or not to get a job based on their current skill set, almost across the board, regardless of the type of degree, you will see a really significant boost in your lifetime earnings and generally speaking, happiness and satisfaction. There's a lot of really excellent programs that aren't necessarily a four-year degree that also provide really strong return on investment too, including through our community colleges and trade programs. But the key point is that higher education is something that is difficult to access because it is really expensive. And it's hard sometimes, I think, to see the long-term return on that investment. Seeing, that you're going to need $20,000 next year to afford going to college can be really intimidating. And it's hard to see that you're going to make $20,000 more per year on average for the rest of your life because of that investment, though. And so it's the type of thing that investing in our education, in our workforce, and in our youth is incredibly important, both for the individuals receiving that investment, but also for our overall economy as we're all more productive.
Well, that's interesting because that's one of these things that maybe is empirically true, but when I see the debate in publications, it seems like there's a lot of people out there who are purporting that college, quote unquote, isn't worth it, and it's just really confusing to me.
That makes sense. I mean, there's plenty of anecdotes of people who attended college for a year and dropped out and now have significant debt. One of the caveats too is that a lot of people have attended less sort of consistently supportive and productive colleges. There's a lot of for-profit universities that do a good job of educating their students, but unfortunately there's a lot of for-profit universities that don't. Mm-hmm. And so we do have a large number of students who are attending college, are getting funding to do so and going to debt to do so, and the colleges themselves aren't the most reputable. And it's really important, I think, too, to realize that our public universities in Oregon, those that we really focus on ensuring have sufficient funding, that they really are solid investments. They are excellent places for people to put their resources, and often, it's much rarer that someone goes into student debt for a degree at a public university in Oregon and comes out with kind of a worthless piece of paper and
Sure.
Tens of thousands of dollars in debt. I know I can speak personally that I attended Oregon State University. I did get tens of thousands of dollars in debt, and it's been incredibly worth it for me because now I have the opportunity to be on the radio talking to you, Mark.
That's great. And of course, here in community radio, we've got big bucks to do these interviews. But
absolutely.
So now, Oregon, is in secondary education has had historically, low graduation rates, and that seems to be a barrier into getting into higher education. And does Oregon have where does Oregon stand in terms of its participation in higher education from its students?
That's a good question. I don't have the specific numbers in front of me, but I know that Oregon, you're absolutely right that our high school graduation rates are quite disheartening. And I mean, when I first looked at the fact that we were in the bottom handful of states for graduating our high school students, it was really shocking to me coming up through our high school system here in Oregon myself. And it is an immense barrier for children who want to graduate throughout the secondary school program and go to higher education and really get the skills they need to flourish in our modern economy. It's a really important and significant barrier. One of the things that we've seen in enrollment in public universities in Oregon is that it's actually up almost 17% since before the recession.
Okay. So
there are a lot more students who are getting through that reality of a lower high school graduation rate, and are still attending higher education. There's a lot of opportunities too for students to get the remedial classes they need at our great community colleges and otherwise to make it into a higher education university in Oregon. One thing I will point out too, though, that's sort of a disappointing caveat to that point, is that one of the reasons our enrollment is so high over that period is because a lot of people lost their jobs and needed to earn new skills
Sure.
To find gainful employment again. So there was a real drive into our higher education universities during the recession. And at that same time, Oregon was cutting our funding to higher education.
Yes.
And so the result of more people attending, a greater demand at the same time, as we had reductions in what the actual funding was, meant that public universities had to fill that gap, and they filled it through higher tuition prices. We've seen since before the recession about a 41% increase in tuition adjusted for the cost of inflation over that period. And so the average student is going to be paying almost $3,000 more in tuition than they would have only 10 years earlier. And so it's a situation where we're actually making college less affordable, while at the same time the need for it was even larger.
Well, there was an effort to raise the corporate tax in a significant way, and a lot of that money was earmarked for education. And you had mentioned earlier, and even though we have a sort of a democratically controlled, House and Senate in Oregon, it was very hard to get any revenue bills passed. And part of that reason was our law for a 3/5 majority to raise revenue in this state. Now, is that unusual, or is that relatively common among the states to have a supermajority to raise revenue?
It's something that far more than just we have. It's not like the kicker in that we're quite unique in having this provision. It is much more common for states to have a larger or some sort of supermajority to pass tax increases. And one of the real problems with that is that we don't need that same level to pass tax expenditures, like we discussed in the last time we had a chance to chat. So, in a lot of ways, it's easier for us to kind of really find it hard to overcome those barriers to properly funding the services we need because of that 3/5 majority. And it's something that I know a number of interest groups looked at trying to reform when it comes to education. Education itself is something in Oregon that we have what's called a quality education model that sets forth what adequate funding for our K through 12 schools would look like. And we underfund that level by billions of dollars and have for years. And not being able to raise sufficient revenue to cover that gap is one of the reasons that high school graduation rate I mentioned earlier has been suffering. And separate from that, adequate funding for our higher education is absolutely a priority, and we need to come up with those resources through our corporations and our highest income Oregonians who are getting the $5,000 almost out of the kicker.
Sure.
We need to ask them to contribute more, since in current tax law and in our current policy in Oregon, they actually contribute a smaller share of their income than middle-class Oregonians.
Interesting. Well, we're talking to Daniel Hauser from Oregon Center for Public Policy, and we've been discussing essentially the basis for this discussion is an article that is linked at the Oregon Center for Public Policy website by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, The Lost Decade in Higher Education Funding. State cuts have driven up tuition and reduced quality. So thank you so much for this conversation, Daniel. Can you tell folks again how they can hear more information from the Oregon Center for Public Policy and the website and any other information you'd like to share to get people plugged in?
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. The Oregon Center for Public Policy, our website is at ocpp.org, and that's where you can sign up to learn more about the research that we produce. You can find out more about Oregon's kicker, about our higher education funding levels, and we have a email list that we send things out to only rarely, and it's a great resource that people can use to stay up to date on how tax policies and funding levels for our schools are keeping up with other states and with what we all expect the state to be funding. And so I also wanted to mention that we are celebrating our 20th anniversary.
Hey, congratulations.
Thank you. We've been creating excellent research over now 2 decades about how Oregon's tax policy impacts the average Oregonian and how our funding for certain services is insufficient for the need. And so we really would like everyone to join us in celebrating our 20th anniversary and come to our website, sign up for our email newsletter, and we'd love to continue this conversation with a lot more of your listeners.
Daniel Hauser, thank you for joining me on Willamette Wake Up, and look forward to talking with you or someone else from OCPP next month.
Thanks so much, Mark. Have a great day.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye.